think we feel less seen than ever before. We feel increasingly part of a machine more than ever before. And the connection between us and meaningful work is becoming, I think, a degree untethered. So we've got this strange disempowered of work where people feel like they have to be present at meetings. But when it comes down to how decisions are made, I feel like I'm in the room when a boss makes a decision. There's a growing sense that we're not all in it together, that the boss is different to us. The boss is earning 5,000 times, in Google's case, I think 10,000 times more than the average employee. And so the CEO pay gap is actually a good illustration of how work is breaking.
Bruce Daisley, he's a man on a mission, a wonderful mission to make work more enjoyable for all. He's a former VP at Twitter. He's the best-selling author of The Joy of Work and his latest book, Fortitude, which challenges traditional ideas around resilience. As the host of Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat podcast, Bruce shares practical insights on creating happier, more productive work environments. Let's dive into his expertise now and learn how we can reshape the way that we work. Welcome to the show, Bruce.
Great to be here.
You talk a lot about the future of work, how it's changing. So with that in mind, what's your wildest prediction for the future?
My wildest prediction is that the world of work already feels broken, and I think it's going to get significantly worse before it gets better. Work is beset with this growing sense of disconnection and loneliness, and I suspect it's only going to get worse.
That's a very pessimistic view. Why do you think it's only going to get worse?
There's a few trends, actually. The first thing, there's been quite a lot written about this year. There's a wonderful Wall Street Journal article about a month ago called The Loneliness of the American Worker, and it catalogued this thing that I think bears examination, really. That one of the things that you might assume if someone talks about loneliness of work, you might assume that, okay, this is a second order effect of remote working, of hybrid working. In fact, it wasn't that at all. In fact, the figures were almost identical for whether people worked on site or whether people worked in a hybrid arrangement. But it speaks to, I think, a sense of disconnection that comes from work. And in fact, Harvard Business Review in October 2024 has published an article talking about loneliness at work. And I think, two articles, three's a trend, so we need one more to prove it. But I think we are in this zone where, if we look into stats, there's a really interesting thing that most workers say that workplace culture is more important to them than pay and conditions. It's really interesting because actually one of the biggest manifestations of workplace culture right now is flexibility. So, it covers many different things. But what we are witnessing in those numbers is that for people to be engaged with work, the single biggest predictor is whether they've got a friend at work. And a lot of us recognize that. I think what that comes down to, if you wanted to sort of scratch below the surface and look into it a bit more, the second biggest predictor is whether someone has received feedback from their boss. And I think all of these are broadly related holistically to a sense that, do we feel seen? And, it's a really interesting challenge. If you're a manager, how can you see the people you work with if you don't actually tangibly see them every day? But I think we feel less seen than ever before. We feel increasingly part of a machine more than ever before. And the connection between us and meaningful work is becoming, I think, a degree untethered. So look, these big challenges, and I think we are witnessing the recognition of that growing importance.
Do you think we have the wrong expectations, though? I mean, this is me sort of playing devil's advocate here, but for centuries, the idea that you'd be a sort of agrarian worker and then have a sort of existential crisis because, you weren't doing enough to change the world, or to work at the kind of coal mine, sort of coal face, and then to sort of worry that your employer sort of has poor green credentials. Like to some extent, these sort of seem a bit like luxury problems.
The whole notion of a career is the invention of the last 50 years. The idea that we would make progress and we would be taking steps to greater self-actualization is an invention of a system that's been trying to breadcrumb us to make us think that, we're going to earn more money by becoming more capable. So no, in fact, the really interesting thing, I've just done some research in the UK, actually. And one of the things that we observed in that is that you do hear more and more from employers. My workers want to be more purposeful. They want more meaningful, purposeful work. What you actually find is it's a bit of a trade-off. A lot of younger workers, a lot of Gen Z workers entering the workforce have realised they're never going to be able to own property. They're never going to be able to, in some cases, pay off their student debts. And it's kind of like the consolation prize. It's like the goodie bag at the end of the kids' party where, okay, well, if I can't get the thing I really need, then at least I won't work for a wretched tobacco making company. And, actually, it's a signal of defeat as much as anything else that workers are saying to their bosses, what is our company policy on Ukraine? What is our company policy on renewable energy? And it's a signal that a lot of people don't feel that their own life goals are remotely achievable anymore.
Do you think we're quite lost? I mean, you could answer that in any altitude, whether it's just lost in life or lost in work.
I think it is to some extent a consequence of shareholder capitalism. One of the things that really comes out recurrently is that the thing that we set about to try and eliminate from work is the thing that might make it a degree more human. There's a wonderful American-Turkish researcher called Zeynep Tan, and she found a really interesting, she's a fascinating individual because she started off as an operations professor at MIT. And what she found was she was studying supply chains, which retail stores, which supermarkets had the best supply chains and so therefore were the most profitable. What you found accidentally along the way is the most profitable firms weren't the ones with the most sophisticated supply chains, but they were fixated on creating a good working environment for their employees, good culture, basically. And, some of that good culture, she says, being nice isn't enough. Just thinking about being a nice employer isn't enough. You need to have a degree of system thinking. So here she's an operations professor. She's fixated on the profitability of businesses. And she found that businesses who put the working experience of employees right at the start of their employee value consideration, they are more profitable, they're faster growing, they're better performing. Right, really interesting. But one of the things that she says, she's got 4 factors that contribute to a good workplace environment. But one of them is operate with slack, small letter S, but operate with sort of give in the system. So if someone's sick, if someone's on vacation, then actually the system doesn't fall down. And actually more specifically, normally, when a system has slack in the system, if a member of the team quits, the whole organisation doesn't fall down. She says that high employee turnover, people quitting, is ruinous for organisations because you just got the constant sense that the managers are filling in the gaps, the work doesn't get done, the standards go down, the productivity goes down. Anyway, operating with slack is a really critical thing. And it's really interesting because there's very famous American anthropologist, psychologist, Robert Putnam, who wrote this iconic book 25 years ago called Bowling Alone. And he talked about how society was going from the collective to the individual, how we were spending more and more time on individual pursuits rather than being part of a bowling league. In his example. And one of the things that he talks about, the reason why work is lonelier now is because we've eliminated all the slack. We've eliminated, culture lives in the gaps between things.
Yeah.
It's the interactions between meetings when you're in the office, or it was the sense that you weren't overloaded, that every minute of your day was accounted for.
Yeah.
They were where culture lived. And it's this recurrent idea that by trying to be efficient, by sort of shareholder capitalism, thinking, how could someone be productive every minute of the day? The strange consequence of that is that work has become more transactional, depersonalized, lonelier. Yeah. And actually, perversely, it's made work less profitable.
You can kind of feel it. I mean, I'm quite an unusual person and maybe I'm looking for things that other people don't, but I actually think that most people can kind of feel a grocery chain where they treat their staff well. In the US, Trader Joe's appears to be a delightful experience, and it's not more expensive, it's actually quite cheap, and you just go in there and you feel like you're part of something. There's the airline, sort of Southwest Airline, feels like all of these people enjoy being around each other, and then you can fly on American Airlines and the whole experience feels quite bitter. Like, there does appear to be a sort of tangible feeling that you get from workplace culture, and it does appear to just be a highly wise business decision where happy staff means happy customers, and happy customers come back and they're more tolerant of mistakes. But why do you think it's quite hard to get this message across? Like if it is so obviously good business, what's stopping companies from doing this? Why are we getting this division of labor, which is making everyone's jobs incredibly miserable? Why are we taking away responsibility from people to actually, use their own freedom to make good choices and keep their customers happy?
Yeah, Zeynep Ton actually talks about Trader Joe's and how it's
palpable.
Really it's so interesting, isn't it? Because if any of us, if you were asked to think about a place that you think has a good workplace culture, you probably think of a restaurant that you went into.
Absolutely.
And there was just something that emanated from all of the servers. There was just,
it's weird.
Just a real... Yeah, that's right. Or clothing stores. There's some clothing stores where you just think, yeah, man, these people are so helpful. They're friendly. Even if I didn't want help, they sort of addressed it. We can sort of witness good culture sometimes right in front of our very eyes. And yet when it comes down to our own businesses, I think organisations are quite often fixated on the next 3 months, 6 months. And so it's really interesting. Zeynep Ton, an inspiration. She got approached by Walmart. And Walmart actually was the benchmark that when she was tracking the growth of these retail businesses, she would measure them against Walmart. And, Walmart was a low performer. We see Walmart as this sort of incredible colossus generating a lot of sort of private business, but generating a lot of revenue. She found dozens of businesses that were growing faster than them, performing better than them. And Walmart came to her, really interestingly, and said, we want to introduce your system. We want to see if we can bring it. And she said, look, there's a degree of system thinking to this. It's not just a quick fix. You need to think about, there's a whole load of policies that go into it. Operating with Slack is one of them, but you need to be mindful of the lived experience of jobs. So, in retail, it's very easy to ask for someone to come in on the morning rush, the lunchtime rush, and the evening rush. But it's a wretched job for the people who have to do it, because you've got to clock off at 10:30 a.m., come back at 12 noon. It's a sort of horrible experience. The good employers think about how can we use those people productively in the gaps. Now, what that is job design. And you and I have worked in the media, technology sectors. There's no job design in those organizations. In fact, to some extent, it's about improvisation. If you never say no to anyone you deal with, if a client comes to you and says, do you do this? You say yes, and you work out how to do it afterwards. There's no sense of demarcating what you do. And what that contributes to is an immensely stressful experience for the people doing it. So look, what we've witnessed in the last 10 years, Microsoft data say that the average person who works in a knowledge job, their total meeting time has gone up threefold. I did some work for a pharmaceutical organisation. I sort of quite often, I was brought in to run a session on burnout, and never have I felt less capable of doing my job, because I got them, I said, who spends more than 15 hours a week in meetings? Everyone put their hand up. A woman stopped me. She said, I'm going to stop you there. We all spend 40 hours a week in meetings. Great. Okay, we've now identified the job we need to fix. The next task is, the reason why we're burnt out is that, you can't, if you treat...
You can't do your job.
That's right.
You have no time to actually do anything.
Exactly that. Or you're on that worst thing, this continual partial attention. Everyone has got their Zoom face on, pretending to pay attention and doing emails. It's like this sort of depersonalized version of work. I said, right, next thing we've got to do, we've got to work out, how could we reduce that amount of time in meetings?
Yeah.
She said, I'm going to stop you there. We're not going to reduce the amount of time we spend in meetings. Well, if you start with that, if you say the version of work that we currently have is the only version of work that exists, then you've answered your own question. And to some extent, I understand that we're all locked in mental models. And one illustration of this is we're all locked in the mental model, all of us, until 2019, that you did your work at work. If one of your friends got a new job, you wouldn't ask them where they were doing it. It was at whatever office they were interviewed at. Yeah. And it was only when that was clearly identified as a variable. Oh, right, you don't have to do it in the office every day. That we suddenly realized, oh, yeah, that was a mental model that was quite constraining for us. And this notion that our jobs can only be done with 40 hours a week of meetings, that everything has to be a meeting, is one of the things that contributes to this exhausted, depersonalized. There's a paradoxical thing where you can spend all your week in meetings and feel lonely. And, people might consider those things to be in opposition to each other because you're surrounded with people.
Yeah.
If the benefit of being around people is feeling understood by those people, then I think meetings are a really clear way not to achieve that.
I've been doing quite a lot of work with sort of big companies going through hard times. And what's really hit me is when you meet people as individuals, they're all incredibly good at their job. They're all very determined. They all work very, very hard. They have amazing intentions. And then you kind of put them together into a kind of meeting construct. And then somehow everyone becomes terrible at their jobs, doesn't make decisions, becomes quite disruptive. They fail to really notice what actually makes a difference. They all feel collectively lost. And I've realized there's an enormous amount of fear going on. Like I feel like people are kind of putting on a kind of work persona and saying the words that are in the script to a kind of work. People are using sort of corporate jargon. People are looking at numbers all day. And I feel like they're doing that to kind of demonstrate to other people that they're kind of good at their job and that they're trying hard and they get it. But, where's all this fear coming from? Like, is this something that you experience a lot yourself? What can we do about fear sort of paralyzing people from being good at their jobs?
A really clear manifestation of this is the interview process of organizations. And if you chat to anyone who's looking for a job, they'll often describe to you something that feels dystopian. There was one time in a place, and not to feel like boomer, but there was a time and a place where you might turn up at a building twice, 3 times, and you'd get a job. Increasingly, now interview processes are very commonly through Zoom or Teams. It's not uncommon to have 5, 6, 7 interviews where effectively you feel like I'm passing through a process where no one's willing to commit to say, I want to hire this person. And so you're just waiting for someone to say, I don't want, I'm going to reject that person. I'm going to sort of decline that person. It's this horrible version of online dating where you're just waiting for the thumbs down. And as a result, candidates can find themselves waiting for weeks and months for any sort of meaningful feedback. Yeah, that's it. It's really interesting to witness this. If you look into the data of this, most workers say that they do the majority of their work in teams. But the consequence of that, teams as in organizations rather than software, but the consequence of that is that about 85% of people say that they don't feel able to make any decisions in their job. So we've got this strange disempowered version of work where people feel like I have to be present at meetings. The idea of not being at meetings feels like I'm failing in my job. But when it comes down to how decisions are made, I feel like I'm in the room when a boss makes a decision. And I think it represents a sort of big challenge for organizations that we've got this collegiate and slow moving version of work. I mean, it seems ripe for disruption. If you asked any team that you work with, I often do this. I say to them, let's do an audit of how much time we spend in meetings. And, very, very commonly, the number is above 15, 16, 17 hours a week. Then, you add the number of emails, Teams pings, Slack messages that they get, and you've effectively got the whole week accounted for. And yet, most people feel like they don't get anything done. And so it feels like all of this is ripe for someone to say, okay, we're going to operate in a far more simplified version. The original ethos of Amazon was interesting in this regard. The original ethos of Amazon, they treated internal communication as almost unnecessary. In fact, when Jeff Bezos was first talking about it, he said, teams shouldn't have to communicate via anything other than API. Basically, you send updates of what you're working on to other teams. But we're not going to do this thing that has become a norm in most workplaces. You're not going to have to go around and present your plans to other teams. You're not going to have to socialize your goals and objectives. And the curse for most big organizations now is a lot of your time is just spent talking to other people. It seems sort of desperately unproductive, really.
Is there a sense of being held to account for too many things? In the sense that, in the 1980s, you're expected to turn up to your job, be reliable, be robust, not complain too much. And then over time, it's almost like you're supposed to come into the work. Everyone's supposed to like you. You're supposed to be a leader that has respect. You're supposed to have colleagues that enjoy being around you. You're supposed to get a sense of purpose from your role. Like there are times when I almost feel like we're supposed to sort of maximize our career against 10 different things, all of which are actually slightly opposed to each other. So to be well liked by people, but also to have a fear, like a firm sense of control over people is quite hard. To do a job which is, rooted in a higher purpose, but at the same time make money for your company, it's quite hard. And I feel at times like people are asked to do so many different things that it'd almost be sensible for companies to cut through some of that stuff and say, actually, we don't really care if you like each other. Ideally be tolerant of each other and respectful to each other. But we're not expecting you to get drunk together on a Thursday night. Or actually, we expect everyone to really, really enjoy being around each other. But we don't expect people to have, this level of firmness and rigidity to their roles. Is there a sense that people are confused about what jobs are about right now?
I mean, look, the interesting thing is that Edelman runs some fascinating research about trust. And one of the things that they find recurrent in their trust index is that our firms, our companies, feel like the biggest thing that we feel we can have some impact over. So, a lot of us feel disenfranchised from political systems, from whether it's city government, national government. We feel like we can't impact that. And actually, that contributes to a sense of sort of disaffection. It's like, no one's listening to me. This feels unjust. I can't change it. Our companies are the biggest small thing that we feel that we can have an impact over. And that's historically always been the case. And so as a result, our jobs quite often are a really tangible part of our identity. When you meet someone, they will often very quickly articulate what they do and where they work. And you hear an immense amount of pride. So a big part of our identity, big part of shaping who I am. One of the things that's happened in the last 5-10 years is that one of the ways that we can measure that identity is by asking people, are the people who work in your organization people like you? Like it's an expression of social identity. Is the boss of this organization a good example of the people who work here? What we've witnessed in the last 5-10 years is that CEO pay has accelerated so significantly that what we're observing is that the average worker on the shop floor used to be a really good predictor whether they liked their job by whether they thought the boss was kind of one of them. Increasingly, there's a growing sense that we're not all in it together, that the boss is different to us. The boss is earning 5,000 times, in Google's case, I think 10,000 times more than the average employee. And so the CEO pay gap is actually a good illustration of how work is breaking. You'll know that Clay Shirky phrase. Not sure I'm able to say it. Enshittification. And he's talked about how the internet has been degraded. Some of the things that worked before by steps have been degraded, and workers had some of that. Am I allowed to say that word? Enshittification. Workers has been degraded a few times by all these things. CEO pay gap is now meaning that you don't feel connected. You're feeling lonelier at work. Work intensity has gone up. And all of these things have served to change something that, let's not overconstrue it. The more that we can have an identity outside of our work, the healthier we are. But if we are going to spend 40 hours a week doing something and it being this sort of immovable part of our adult lives, then having some satisfaction and connection and joy from it is actually a really important part of living a complete life. And we've seen this degradation of work, I think, over the last few years.
I mean, in theory, technology should have made it better. Like in theory, having a laptop means that we can work from home when the plumber comes. Like in theory, having a mobile phone means that we can make calls as we're seeing our sick mom. Like in theory, it means that we can have more immersive and more intimate meetings and feel closer with people and communicate better. But it does kind of appear it's been somewhat detrimental so far. When you look towards the future, do you think technology can be a big part of the solution, or is it kind of the problem still?
I think there's a big opportunity for organisations to try and seek to differentiate themselves, to bring some degree of work design, job design, trying to say what each person is hired for, and here's what they need to be apprised of, and here's how they need to stay connected to each other, and try and think about that. It's really good. I suspect, like me, Tom, you were in the workplace when email arrived on people's phones. And that feels like, firstly, second example today, where it's been sort of a little bit okay boomer, but it's sort of 15 years ago, really, when email arrived on most people's phones.
Yeah. It's fascinating to think of this stuff, actually. There was a kind of, there was a status to being given a BlackBerry because it meant you were important enough, to be working into the evening. So that, I think email and the mobile phone are both the worst and the best things to ever happen to the working world. So.
Well, you'll remember those status battles that one of your colleagues would pull a BlackBerry out of their phone and you'd be like, you'd sidle up to them and say, how did you get that? Yeah, what words did you say to IT? And it became this viral moment where people would tell you what they told IT. Okay, I'm going to leave it a week and then I'm going to try those words. But it became this thing. But the interesting thing is that firstly, productivity has barely grown since that era. That's really interesting. This transformational technology improvement, but it hasn't actually been transferred. But in addition, when that first arrived, it's worth rewinding the clock. What we presumed was it was going to turn moments of idleness into times that we could get the boring part of the job done. Yes. You could answer an email when you're on the subway. You could answer an email while you're in reception waiting for someone. You could use idle time to kill those things. And what's happened actually is the ease of communication has meant that communication has grown exponentially. Now, do we feel more informed, or do we feel like we're getting things done better? No, I don't think we do. Information has risen to fill that gap. Look, how can we think about these things? With an eye on solving them. What we know is that the more someone feels empowered to do their job, the more they feel that their opinion is listened to, the more motivated they are at work. So if people feel like, I know how I can do my job and I'm going to get it done, and that's how they're judged. And so that means to some extent writing narrower but more specific job descriptions that, look, you've been hired to do marketing and these are the stakeholders you need to keep informed, but these are the assets you need to create, and almost sort of not encumbering that person with 20 hours of week internal meetings, but thinking specifically about the outputs, but then trying to create some degree of connection to the people immediately around them. And I think what often happens is, as organizations get better, there's such a huge army of people that people feel they need to be connected into. It has the perverse effect of making them feel more isolated. So look, I think there's big opportunities for organizations who are willing to try and do something different. If strategic differentiation is looking at what your competitors do and thinking what you disagree with it, there's plenty of scope for people to say, okay, we're going to create an organization which is tiny little micro units. They're far more autonomous. They're going to have far less time taken up in meetings. I think that there is scope to try to reinvent organizations based on that.
To what extent is the advice that you're talking about universal to wildly different types of companies? Because I'm always aware that any discussion about remote work, any discussion about hybrid working, like it's always led by people who quite often have quite unusual jobs. Very, very few people are thinking about shelf stackers in supermarkets. Very few people are thinking about people that work for Leicestershire City Council in the library. How applicable is the advice that you give to a wide variety of companies and sectors and roles?
I think that's the inspiration of the Zeynep Ton work, because it started with retail, and her philosophy was very, very consciously, I want to see what are the most profitable firms in this sector. And actually, she's gone on. She wrote a second book last year called the Good Jobs Strategy, the Good Jobs strategy, where she said actually this is applicable for other firms. And what goes to the heart of it is making conscious decisions about how you're going to design people's jobs and be specific about what you're going to do. So I think that's the critical thing, that this isn't first world problems of people doing a media job or using Canva to create assets for social media. This is actual jobs that people do, and I think that's an important realization. I think the rooting ourselves in the empathy of the lived experience of a lot of different people is a really critical element of this. And it's one of the challenges of the last few years. What we've witnessed is, Publicis this week, when we're recording this, they just fired about 100 employees who didn't return to the office. And look, I think any employer has got the right to implement their rules and to have a system. But I probably suspect that represents a dissonance between those people where they live. They might live far further away than they did before. They've travelled into the office on several days and they've thought, I didn't need to be here today. And the people who've told me to do this don't understand my job. I've spent the whole day on Teams calls. I've spent the whole day doing this. You know what? I think if I don't go in tomorrow, no one will notice, right? And so what we've got broadly there is a disconnect between the bosses, what the bosses think they need to do, because in the old days, that's the way that the office worked. If you couldn't hear the phones, then the business was bad. And to a new version of kind of that's less important right now. And I don't think, what Publicis had was a legion of disobedient employees, but they probably had a legion of intelligent people thinking, I don't think I need to do this to do my job. And that kind of represents the disagreement, actually, the misunderstanding, the misalignment that's going on in work right now.
It's fascinating to me, actually, even the sort of balance of power between employers and employees. For so long, it always seemed like the kind of bosses were in control. And then I guess sort of through COVID and through sort of quiet quitting, it almost seemed like it was the role of an employer to kind of, persuade people to work, to sort of coax people into doing their jobs. Then we had sort of quiet quitting and tons of free money in the economy that meant that everyone seemed to be doing okay. And then now we're probably getting to that inflection point again, where to some extent employers, can sort of call the shots. And I think it's created an environment where no one really knows what the rules are anymore. No one really knows what they're accountable to do. No one knows what's reasonable. No one knows what's legal. No one knows what's a kind of etiquette. Like it's really hard out there. Are there particular sort of companies or case studies that you would want people to draw their attention to kind of learn from how best to do this?
I think you raise a really key point. One of the things you often observe is that there are pockets of good performance in organisations.
Yeah.
You often struggle to witness it exhibited at the whole organisation. And the old truism about culture is there's as many different cultures as there are leaders, as team leaders. And so, we've all worked in an environment where the team over there is really miserable and all quitting, and the team over there seems to be having the time of their lives, the best job in their careers. I think we organisations that are focused on empowering their workers and trying to have some degree of responsibility. So you often observe this in retail chains. Some are very good at empowering local stores. Some are very good at empowering local offices, and some have the rules coming from corporate. And I think it's broadly similar. That what we're finding is there are pockets of good performance where decision making is devolved as far as shop floor, and generally those organisations are in better health.